Not too long ago, we stumbled upon 3 poachers here in the mountains, chainsaw in hand. And not only have they been stealing our telephone lines, they've also been stealing the poles. Now today I'm going to build a little bit on my previous video on the basics of reading spoor and sign, and I'm going to go into reading human tracks in the bush. I'm Clarice, you're on the Live Ready channel. Track someone in the bush can tell us if there is a potential threat to us there. It can also help us to find someone who's lost, or as a friend of ours recently put it, if they've got resources that you need, you're going to need to be able to track them. To be able to track someone in the bush, we need to understand a bit of their psychology and be able to put ourselves in their shoes. We need to develop those mental models or the constructs in our mind that help us to interpret and understand the environment around us. And it's not just their tracks that we're reading, it's also the signs that they leave behind in the bush. This video is part of a 2-part series. In the first video, I did a bit of the basics of reading spoor and sign, and I did a bit of tracking animals. In this video, I'm going to focus more on tracking humans and reading their movements in the bush. Now, the first thing I did this morning when I started out on my walk up into the mountains here was to check what other signs and tracks do I see around me, because it gives me an idea of what I'm going to encounter in the bush. Now, other signs that we can read from the environment are things like broken branches, overturned foliage, places where the foliage is disturbed, anything that looks kind of uncomfortable to you. And if you take a step back and you look at the environment around you, is there something that looks overturned, that looks like it wanted to roll in a different direction? And don't be fooled, even old broken branches can have new breaks in them. Other signs that we can look out for are things like dew that's been disturbed or moved off of the branches. It can be grass that's been flattened where someone has walked on the grass, or where they've moved the foliage aside to be able to make a clearing or a space for themselves. After I've just walked through the bush here, you can see where the grass has been flattened and it gives that shiny sheen where it reflects the sunlight to the camera. And you can see the trail where I walked through the bush here, and that's a telltale sign of someone who's trying to stay off the road, who doesn't want to be tracked. And anything that looks like a deliberate move in the bush can be human rather than animal. So if you, for example, find a tree where there are 3 broken branches, those branches are broken to the same extent, it looks quite deliberate, and one branch, for example, is folded behind the other, you can be certain it's human and not a baboon or some other animal that's tried to climb up the tree. A moment ago I said it's important to understand the psychology behind why people move the way they do, because it will help you to track them. So right here, for example, I've got a track of a bicycle, a mountain bike, judging by the tire, and there's a track that runs next to it, and the track consistently runs next to it, and it's the same print. So this tells me that it's someone who was pushing their bicycle rather than riding it. And the reason why I think that they were also pushing it is because they're consistently pushing from the same side. So the track remains towards the right-hand side of the bicycle print. So my guess is that this is a left-handed person who doesn't know the area very well, but is relatively fit, because they've made a couple of circles behind me here on the road, not being able to decide which direction to go in, and that these tracks were made this morning and that the person has left the area because there are tracks going back downhill again. It's important to notice whether people have backtracked on their original tracks, because it will tell you if you're likely to meet them in the area. Now, other signs that we can look for with humans is litter that they've left behind, and litter can actually be quite easy to age because water tends to accumulate in the litter over time, and you can tell by the labels and everything on it, and by how deep it's been lying in the soil, how old that litter is. And of course, if you're searching for someone who's got resources that you need, that litter that they leave behind can be a confirmation of whether they actually have the resources that you assume they do and that you're looking for. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time tracking someone who doesn't have what you need. Another thing that can tell us if somebody is in the area or has left the area is the presence or the absence of birds and wildlife. Birds will usually leave an area when you enter it, so if they do then fly away, then you know that you are the only person who's likely to be in that area unless somebody has stayed very still for a long time. But somebody who's moving through the bush will disturb the birds and the birds will fly away. And if birds fly away ahead of you and you haven't entered that area yet, it might be an indication that someone else has entered the area in front of you and that your quarry isn't very far ahead of you. Now, there are some other signs that you can look for in the bush as well to determine whether what you're following is actually human, because you're not always going to get a perfectly clear footprint. Sometimes it's going to be something else that tells you that there's a human that's passed by there. Things like recent tire tracks can tell you that there might be more than one person around. Human excrement can also tell you how long ago somebody has passed by the area. The moisture, the smell, the heat emanated from that sign can tell you a lot about that person too. If you get a really pungent ammonia smell from urine, you can be sure that person is starting to get dehydrated, and if you're following them because you're looking for water, you might be wasting your time. Whereas someone who's a diabetic will have a really sweet appleish smell to their urine. Now, just a couple of principles on reading tracks in the bush, especially if you're following humans, and whether it's a vehicle track or whether it's a human footprint. The first thing you want to do is you want to look high and low. So you can be so focused on reading the footprints in the ground that you miss all the other signs in the trees, branches that were deliberately broken, or if you find fur on those branches, you might actually be looking at an animal that you're following instead of a human. Then secondly, determine what made your tracks. Is it a bicycle? Is it a vehicle? Was it a person? Did they leave half a footprint in the sand, or did they just overturn some foliage? Was it then an animal perhaps? Thirdly, you want to be able to age that spoor. How long ago did that person pass by there? And the crispness of that track can tell you a lot about when that person passed by there. Then, as I mentioned in my basics of reading spoor and sign video, you ideally want a light on the opposite side of the track because it casts shadows and it illuminates the depths properly so that you can adequately determine which tracks are on top and read the track better. Then if you are tracking at night, don't use white light because it will ruin your night vision. That goes for cell phone screens as well. Use a green light or a red light to help you track at night. To determine the amount of people in a group, if you're following a group of people, you can take the trail that you're following and subdivide it into average step or stride lengths, which is usually around about 1.3 to 1.5 meters. Subdivide it, count the amount of steps or prints in that one stride length or one block, round it up to an even number, then divide it by 2. And that will usually give you the amount of people that you're following if you're following a group of people. But don't grow overconfident because there are a lot of ways that people can use anti-tracking methods to throw you off. And if you start to get overconfident, you can easily miss a couple of those signs. Then when you're looking at footprints in the sand, look at the relationship between the stride length and the depth of that print. So someone, for example, who's carrying a backpack or a heavy load is going to have shorter strides, deeper prints. Someone who is running, for example, is going to have much longer strides, but the print at the toe is going to be a bit deeper because that toe off is much harder when you're jogging or running. I know this can be a little bit tricky to see on camera, but the difference between this step over here of this person and this step over here is about 20 centimeters longer than my own. That would tell me that it's either a really large male or more likely somebody who was jogging here. You can see that this toe depression here has been left behind while the rest of the print is aged actually quite quickly because of the wind. So he's most likely jogging because his toe off depressions are so pronounced. The sun hasn't quite evaporated all of that moisture yet. If it is a female, what size shoe are we looking at? Probably a similar size to my own. So likely this was a female who came jogging past here this morning. You can see that the toe depression here is still a little bit damp. Then if you lose the track or you're struggling to see it, you can always get really low to the ground. Now I can see really nicely where these tracks go, and I can analyze the depth depressions in them really clearly. Of course, if you find a print like mine, where somebody has lain on the ground, you know somebody else is doing some tracking in the bush. So if the soil gets really compressed down the road and I lose the track, or it's difficult to see the tracks, then this is a method that I can use to see the shiny parts where the soil has been compressed, and the sun will illuminate those compressed parts to me. You can also train yourself to learn whether they're favoring one leg or the other one. So if one leg keeps on having a shorter stride and the opposite leg has a longer stride, then you can often tell that they're favoring a leg. That leg will also often have a slightly different print where the print will be deeper in certain areas depending on the injury or depending if they're just carrying a load like a chainsaw. Sometimes just having a toe touch the ground will tell you of an injury, whereas the other foot has a flat whole print. That half print will tell you that they're limping. Telling the difference between male and female prints can be a little bit tricky because of the availability of unisex shoes. But females tend to point their toes straight forward, whereas males have a toe out. Females have smaller and narrower feet, where males have longer strides and much wider strides and wider feet. So you can sometimes determine, but it is also very tricky because you could have a male who is a small male with a shorter stride and a smaller footprint. And we can take a bit of advice from the famous combat tracker John Hurth, who suggested making aging stands, and this is something you can do at home. Take a couple of blocks of soil at home or just demarcate them, and then every week add the same kinds of signs and spoor and things that you leave behind, rubbish or whatever, and then see how they age and get to know how tracks look as they age, especially in the elements. I had a good laugh the other day when someone posted on one of the tracking forums a picture of lion tracks following on those of poachers. And it's important to know who's following who in the bush, because in that example you'll probably find the lion before the poachers. Then when you do start to catch up with your quarry in the bush, remember to use your senses. Your sense of hearing is actually quite sharp, and you'll often hear people before you can see or smell them. But someone who hasn't washed for a long time or who's made a campfire, you would actually be able to smell before you see them. Well, that's it from me. Go make some aging stands and learn how to read, spoor and sign. I've seen some tracks age really quickly here today just because of the elements. It's really amazing to see it. Check the video description for any gear links that I've posted for recommended gear or equipment or useful resources. And until the next time, live ready.